In a small, quiet bedroom, the world was anything but quiet for an 8-year-old boy named Arav. His room wasn't just a room. It was a battlefield where brave knights made of cardboard fought dragons crafted from old pillows. His bed was a pirate ship sailing on a sea of blue carpet, and his closet was a dark cave, hiding treasures that were really just his worn-out sneakers. Arav lived inside his head, a place filled with epic stories and grand adventures. He could spend hours whispering dialogue for his action figures, creating entire worlds with nothing but his imagination. He loved stories more than anything. He loved the way they could make you feel brave, or sad, or excited. He just wished he could read them on his own dot at school. However, Arav's world felt very small and very gray. His classroom was a place of rules and straight lines, a place where his imagination felt like a secret he had to keep hidden. The biggest challenge, the monster he faced every single day, was the big book on his desk. When the other kids read aloud, their voices flowed like a river, smooth and easy. But when it was Arav's turn, the river turned into a bumpy, confusing mess. The letters on the page would jiggle and dance. They would swim in front of his eyes, refusing to stay still and make sense. A B would flip and become a D. A P would stand on its head and look like a Q. Simple words like the and was became tricky puzzles he had to solve every time he saw them. His teacher, Mrs. Davison, was a woman who believed in order. She had a sharp, loud voice that could cut through the classroom noise like a knife. She would tap her long fingernails on the desk when she was impatient, a sound that made Arav's stomach clench. She didn't understand why Arav was so slow. She saw a boy who was daydreaming, a boy who wasn't trying hard enough. "Focus, Arav," she would say, her voice tight with frustration. "It's not that difficult. You're just not paying attention." The other kids would sometimes giggle, and Arav would feel his face get hot. He would stare down at the book, his heart pounding in his chest, wishing he could just disappear into the floor. He was trying. He was trying so hard it made his head hurt, but the words just wouldn't behave for him. The struggle wasn't just about reading. Writing was even worse. His pencil felt clumsy in his hand, and his letters would come out crooked and backwards. His spelling tests always came back covered in red marks, looking like they had been in a fight. His parents would try to help. His mom would sit with him at the kitchen table every night, sounding out words slowly and patiently. "Seti, cat," she'd say, her voice gentle and encouraging. But the next day, the letters would be all mixed up in his head again. His dad would tell him stories before bed, amazing tales of heroes and monsters, hoping to spark a love for the words that Arav found so difficult. They knew he was a smart kid. They saw the incredible worlds he built with his toys. They just couldn't understand why those same words that made up such wonderful stories became a wall. When they were on a page, the breaking point came during a parent-teacher conference. Arav's parents sat in the small, stiff chairs in Mrs. Davison's classroom, their hands clasped tightly in their laps. They had hope in their eyes. They were there to ask for help, to find a way to help their son. Mrs. Davison sat behind her big desk, a thick file folder in front of her. She didn't smile. She opened the folder and pushed a few of Arav's worksheets across the desk. They were covered in his messy handwriting and the teacher's red corrections. "As you can see," she began, her voice all business, "Arav is significantly behind. His reading and writing skills are not where they should be." "Not even close?" Arav's mom leaned forward. Is there something we can do? A special program? Maybe he just learns differently." Mrs. Davison let out a small sigh, as if she had answered this question 100 times. "We've tested him. He has what they call dyslexia. It's a learning disability. Frankly, it's a severe case." She said the word disability like it was a life sentence. She looked from the mother to the father, her expression unchanging. "I know you have big dreams for him, but it's time to be realistic. The academic world is built on reading and writing. It's a fundamental skill that he simply doesn't have, and I'm not convinced he ever will." Arav's dad spoke up, his voice a little shaky. "But he's so creative. He tells the most amazing stories. He wants to be a writer one day." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Mrs. Davison's face. It might have been pity, but it looked more like annoyance. She picked up one of Arav's stories, a short tale he had dictated to his mom and then tried to write himself. The page was a mess of crossed-out words and misspellings. She held it up for them to see. "With this? I'm sorry to be blunt, but that's not going to happen. He's not wired for it. Forcing him will only lead to more frustration and failure. It's kinder to accept his limitations and guide him toward something more practical." She placed the paper back down on the desk with a final sounding thud. "It would be better for everyone if you just didn't even bother trying." Outside in the quiet hallway, Arav was pressed against the door, his ear to the cool wood. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but he had heard his name. He heard every single word. Each one felt like a tiny stone being thrown at him. Disability, limitations, failure. And then the last one, the one that landed the heaviest blow. Don't even bother trying. The words echoed in his head, drowning out everything else. The hope his parents had walked in with was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. He felt a coldness spread through his chest, a feeling that his wonderful, colorful world was suddenly being drained of all its color, turning into the same gray as his classroom. He backed away from the door, his heart feeling like a heavy stone in his chest. The monster wasn't just in the book anymore. It was inside him, and a teacher had just given it a name. The words from the classroom followed Arav home like a dark cloud. They weren't just words anymore. They were a heavy, wet blanket that smothered the fire in his imagination. The next day at school, he was a ghost in his own seat. When it was time for reading, he didn't even pretend to look at the book. He just stared at the chipped paint on his desk, tracing the cracks with his eyes. He felt Mrs. Davison's gaze on him a few times, but it was different now. It wasn't frustrated or angry. It was a look of confirmation, as if to say, "See? I told you so." The other kids didn't giggle anymore. They just ignored him, which in some ways was even worse. He had become invisible, a boy who had already been given up on. At home, the pirate ship on his blue carpet sea remained docked. The brave cardboard knights stood guard over a silent castle. His action figures were lined up on his shelf, their plastic faces frozen in expressions of adventure he no longer felt. His parents tried everything. His dad brought home a new comic book, thinking the bright pictures might help. Arav just glanced at it and pushed it away. His mom tried to get him to tell her one of his stories, the way he used to, but he just shook his head and mumbled that he was tired. The stories were gone. The teacher's words had reached into his mind and stolen them. He felt like a broken toy, and no one knew how to fix him. Weeks passed, and the color continued to drain from his world. Leaving everything in shades of gray. One afternoon, the sky matched his mood. A heavy, persistent rain began to fall, drumming a lonely rhythm on the roof. The house felt too small, too quiet. Feeling a desperate need to escape, even if it was just into the wet, gray world outside, Arav pulled on his raincoat and boots. He didn't tell his mom where he was going. He just walked out the door with no real destination in mind. The rain was cold on his face, and he liked it. It felt like the world was crying with him. He walked through puddles, watching the water splash, not caring that his jeans were getting soaked. He just kept walking until he found himself standing in front of the town's public library. He hadn't been there in a long time. It seemed like as good a place as any to get out of the rain. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and was instantly wrapped in the warm, quiet smell of old paper and floor wax. It was a peaceful place, a world away from the noise of his classroom and the silence of his room. He took off his dripping hood and just stood there for a moment, looking at the tall shelves that seemed to go on forever. He wasn't here for a book. He couldn't read them anyway. He was just here to be alone, to be anonymous in a place full of stories he could no longer touch. He wandered through the aisles, his fingers lightly brushing against the spines of books he knew he would never open. He felt a familiar pang of sadness. He was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't notice the woman watching him from behind the main desk. She was the librarian, Miss Anjali, a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile that seemed to be permanently fixed on her face. She had seen many kids come in over the years, some happy, some sad, but there was something about this boy that caught her attention. He wasn't just looking around. He was looking at the books with a strange mixture of love and deep pain. She saw him stop in front of a display of fantasy novels, his eyes fixed on a cover painting of a magnificent dragon soaring over a mountain castle. He didn't pick it up. He just stood there, staring at the picture. His shoulders slumped. Miss Angeli walked over quietly, not wanting to startle him. "That's a great one," she said in a gentle voice. "The artist who painted that is really good. That dragon looks pretty fierce, doesn't he?" Arav jumped a little, surprised. He looked up at her, his eyes wide. He just nodded, not trusting his voice. "I'm Miss Angeli," she said, her smile warm. "I haven't seen you in here before. What's your name?" "Arav," he whispered. "It's nice to meet you, Arav. Do you like dragons?" she asked, gesturing to the book. He nodded again, a little more confidently this time. "They're my favorite," he mumbled. "But I can't read the story inside." He said it with a sense of finality, as if it were a law of the universe. He braced himself for the usual look of pity or the suggestion that he try an easier book, but Miss Angeli's expression didn't change. She just tilted her head slightly. "Oh, well, who says you have to read with your eyes?" Arav looked at her, confused. What did that mean? How else could you read a book? She saw the confusion on his face and her smile widened. "Come with me. I want to show you something." She led him over to a different section of the library, one he had never noticed before. There were shelves filled with plastic cases, just like the ones for his dad's movies, but these had pictures of books on them. "These are audiobooks," she explained. "Someone reads the story out loud and you can listen to it." She took one down, a story about a young boy and his pet dragon. "You just put these headphones on," she said, handing him a pair of big, comfortable-looking headphones. "And press this little green button." Arav hesitantly put the headphones on. Miss Angeli showed him how to start the player. He pressed the button. Suddenly, a deep, friendly voice filled his ears, clear as a bell. Asterisk long ago, in a kingdom hidden by mist, there lived a boy named Finn who was smaller than all the other boys his age. Asterisk Arav's eyes went wide. The words weren't jumbled. They weren't dancing on a page. They were flowing directly into his mind, painting pictures more vivid than any he had ever seen on his own. He closed his eyes, and he was no longer in a quiet library. He was in that misty kingdom, standing next to Finn. It was magic. Pure, simple magic. He listened for the entire hour, completely lost in the story. When it was over, he slowly took the headphones off, the world of the library fading back in. He looked at Miss Angeli, a question in his eyes. She was smiling, knowing exactly what he was feeling. "See, the story is still there. You just have to find a different door to get inside it." She then led him to another section, this one filled with books that were bigger and had more pictures than words. "These are graphic novels," she said. "The pictures tell a big part of the story. You can follow the adventure just by looking at the art, and maybe you'll recognize some of the words along the way." She handed him one. It was about a robot who wanted to become an artist. Arav opened it. The pages were filled with colorful panels, showing the robot's feelings and actions without needing many words. He could understand it. He could follow the story. For the first time in months, he felt a tiny spark inside him, a flicker of the old fire. It wasn't a big flame, not yet, but it was there. He looked from the audiobook in his hand to the graphic novel in the other, and then up at Miss Angeli's kind face. The gray world around him suddenly had a crack of light shining through it. He walked out of the library that day with 2 new treasures tucked under his arm, not even noticing that the rain had stopped and the sun was peeking through the clouds. The walk home from the library that day was different. The gray clouds had parted, and the setting sun cast long, golden fingers of light across the sidewalks. Arav didn't even notice the puddles he was splashing through. His mind was buzzing, replaying the friendly voice from the headphones and the colorful panels of the graphic novel. The world, which had felt so small and suffocating for weeks, suddenly felt full of possibilities again. He clutched the plastic audiobook case and the graphic novel tightly under his arm, not as if they were library books, but as precious treasure maps. Back in his room, the cardboard knight seemed to stand a little taller. The pirate ship on the blue carpet sea looked ready to set sail once more. That night, instead of staring at the wall, Arav put on the headphones. His parents peeked into his room, their hearts lifting at the sight of their son, eyes closed, a small smile on his face as he listened to his story. They didn't understand what had changed, but they were grateful for the shift. The audiobooks became his constant companions. He listened while he built with his blocks, while he ate his breakfast, and while he looked out the car window on the way to school. He was devouring stories at an incredible rate. His mind, once a prison of jumbled letters, was now a library where he could wander freely. He learned about plot without ever seeing the words written down. He understood character through the tone of a narrator's voice. He absorbed the rhythm and flow of language, not by reading it, but by hearing it. The graphic novels opened up another door. He would sit for hours, tracing the lines of the art with his finger. He saw how a single, well-drawn picture could show a character's fear or their joy. He learned that a story wasn't just about words. It was about action, about showing instead of telling. His imagination, which had been in hiding, came roaring back to life, but now it was stronger. It was fueled by hundreds of stories he had consumed. Giving it new tools and new colors to paint with, he became a regular at the library. A quiet shadow that moved through the aisles with purpose. Miss Angeli would always greet him with a warm smile, ready with a new recommendation. She never pushed him, never asked him to read. She just watched him grow, seeing the light return to his eyes. One day, as he was returning a stack of audiobooks, she asked him a simple question. "You've listened to so many amazing adventures," she said, leaning on her desk. "Do you ever think about telling your own?" Arav looked down, shuffling his feet. The old feeling of shame pricked at him. "I can't write," he mumbled, the words feeling like a lead weight in his mouth. Miss Anjali shook her head gently. "Who said anything about writing?" "I'm talking about telling. A story starts in your head and in your voice long before it ever gets on paper." She reached under her desk and pulled out an old, small tape recorder, the kind his dad used to use for work. "Why don't you borrow this? Just press the red button and talk. Tell me about one of your pirates. What's his name? Where is he sailing to today?" Arav took the recorder, its smooth plastic cool in his hand. That night, sitting in his fortress of pillows, he held it up to his mouth. His heart was thumping. He pressed the red button. A soft click. He hesitated, then started to talk, his voice barely a whisper at first. "Captain." Captain Arav stood on the bow of his ship, the Sea Dreamer. As he spoke, the words began to flow more easily. He wasn't thinking about spelling or grammar. He wasn't thinking about letters that danced. He was just describing the world he saw so clearly in his head. He talked for 20 minutes, describing a thrilling storm at sea and a mysterious island. When he played it back, he heard his own voice telling a story. And it felt like magic, but a story on a tape recorder was a secret. It was ephemeral. He wanted to see it. He wanted to make it real. This desire led him to the family computer. His mom showed him a program called speech-to-text. He could speak into a microphone and the words would appear on the screen. It felt like a miracle. He put on the headset, clicked on the blank document, and took a deep breath. He started telling his pirate story again, and words began to appear on the screen. Asterisk, the dragon flew over the mountain. He saw it and his heart soared. But then he kept talking. Asterisk, the dragon flew over the fountain. He stopped. The words on the screen were wrong. They were jumbled. It was the same battle all over again, just on a different battlefield. Frustration boiled up inside him. He spoke more clearly, more slowly. The knight drew his sword. The computer typed. The knight drew his sword. He wanted to scream. He wanted to flip the desk. This was just another trick, another way for the world to tell him he wasn't good enough. He slammed the laptop shut and pushed it away, the old, familiar feeling of defeat washing over him. For 2 days, he didn't touch it. He went back to just listening, the joy now tainted with a bit of sadness. On the third day, he was sitting in his room, feeling sorry for himself, when the memory of Mrs. Davison surfaced. He saw her sharp, unsmiling face. He heard her voice, clear as day, saying those terrible words to his parents. Asterisk, it would be better for everyone if you just didn't even bother trying. Something inside him shifted. The sadness and shame he had felt for months began to harden into something else. It wasn't hot anger, but a cold, quiet determination. Her words weren't a life sentence. They were a challenge. She had thrown down a gauntlet, and he had just been lying on the ground. Accepting it, he walked over to the desk and opened the laptop. The jumbled words were still there. He deleted them. He took a deep breath and started again. "The knight," he said, carefully and loudly, drew his sword. This time the computer got it right. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. He realized this wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be a fight. But for the first time, he felt like he could actually win. This became his new routine, his secret mission. Every day after school, he would spend an hour at the computer. It was a grind. He had to learn to speak like a robot, pausing between words to make sure the computer understood. He had to go back and fix every mistake, a process that was slow and painful. He was teaching himself to edit, to recognize the wrong word and find the right one. His parents saw him struggling and wanted to help, but he waved them away. This was his fight. The memory of Mrs. Davison's dismissive tone became his fuel. Every time the computer typed the wrong word, he didn't get angry. He just fixed it, thinking, "I'm bothering. I'm trying." Years passed in this way. Arav grew from a small boy into a teenager. The tape recorder was replaced by a better microphone. The simple speech-to-text software was upgraded. He never stopped consuming stories through audio and pictures, and he never stopped creating his own. His writing style became unique. Because he had learned from listening, his dialogue was sharp and natural. Because he had learned from graphic novels, his descriptions were visual and action-packed. He wasn't just writing around his dyslexia. He was writing with it, turning his weakness into a strange kind of strength. By the time he was 15, the stack of printed stories on his desk was tall. They were all short, but they were complete. And one day, he looked at them and had a new, terrifying, and exciting thought. What if he didn't just write a short story? What if he wrote a whole book? What if he took all the skills he had learned in his secret, years-long battle and aimed for something bigger? The idea took root, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he had to do it. He had to finish it. He had to hold a real book with his name on the cover just to see the look on a certain teacher's face. The final word of his novel appeared on the screen, and Arav felt a wave of exhaustion so deep it was almost like pain. For months, his world had shrunk to the glowing rectangle of his computer monitor and the four walls of his bedroom. He had fought every single step of the way. He'd spoken the words, fought with the software to get them right, and then spent hours editing the text, a process that was like trying to build a ship in a bottle with giant, clumsy hands. There were days when the old frustration would bubble up, days when he would read a paragraph he'd written and it would seem lifeless and wrong. But then he would remember Mrs. Davison's voice, that cold, final tone, and he would push through. He wasn't just writing a story anymore. He was building a fortress, one word at a time, to protect that little boy who had been told to stop trying. When he finally typed the end, he didn't feel a surge of joy. He just leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and felt a profound, draining emptiness. It was done. The next challenge was even more intimidating. He had a story, but it was just a file on his computer. He wanted it to be a real book with a cover and pages and a place on a library shelf. His dad helped him research how to get published. They sent out emails to big, important publishing houses in the city. Arav would pour his heart into a short letter, explaining his story and his unique way of writing, and then attach his manuscript. And then he would wait. Most of the time, he waited for nothing. No reply at all. Other times, he would get a short, cold email that said something like, "Thank you for your submission, but your project does not meet our current needs." Each rejection felt like a small echo of Mrs. Davison's words. It was a new, more polite way of being told, "Don't bother." He started to believe that maybe his dream of a real book was just that, a dream. He was about to give up when he received an email from a small, independent publisher he had almost forgotten he'd contacted. They were called Whispering Pages Press, and they didn't have a big fancy office in the city, just a small team of people who loved stories. The email was from an editor named Rohan. It didn't sound like a form letter. Rohan wrote that he had read the whole manuscript and was blown away by the vivid, almost cinematic quality of the storytelling. He wrote, "Your narrative voice is unlike anything I've ever read. It's clear you learn to tell stories through listening and seeing, and it gives your work an incredible sense of action and emotion. We would be honored to publish this." Arav read the email 3 times, his heart pounding. For the first time, someone didn't just see his dyslexia. They saw the unique strength that had grown from it. The months that followed were a blur of exciting new experiences. He worked with Rohan on editing the story, a process that was challenging but collaborative. He helped choose the cover art, a painting of a boy holding a glowing, magical map that looked like a maze. And then, one day, a box arrived at his house. Inside were 10 copies of his book. It had a real cover with his name printed right under the title, The Map of Whispering Paths. He picked one up. It felt solid, real. It smelled like new paper and ink. He ran his fingers over his name. His mom started to cry, and his dad put a hand on his shoulder, his eyes shining with pride. This was it. The fortress was built to celebrate, and to thank the place where it all began, Rohan arranged for his first official book signing to be held at the local public library. Miss Angeli was thrilled. She set up a table right near the entrance with a big poster of his book cover. On the day of the signing, Arav was a nervous wreck. His hands were sweaty, and he felt like he might be sick. What if no one showed up? What if they just laughed at him? But as the afternoon began, a small line started to form. His parents were there, beaming. Ms. Angeli was there, handing out bookmarks. Some of his old school friends came, curious and supportive. And there were strangers, people who had seen a small ad in the local newspaper or a post online. He signed his name over and over. Arav, the letters still a little clumsy but now filled with a new confidence. He was talking to people about his story, about the boy who couldn't read a normal map but could find his way by following the whispers of the wind. He was an author. He was in the middle of signing a book for a young girl who told him she loved dragons when he happened to glance up at the end of the line. And his world stopped. Standing there, near the shelf of audiobooks, looking older and smaller than he remembered, was Mrs. Davison. Her hair was grayer, and she wasn't wearing her sharp teacher's clothes. She just looked like a regular person waiting patiently. The noise of the library, the chatter of the people, the sound of his own pen scratching on the paper, it all faded into a dull hum. It was as if he and she were the only 2 people in the room. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach, the same feeling he used to get in her class. He quickly finished signing the girl's book and handed it to her. His hands trembling slightly, he watched as the line moved forward, one person at a time. With each step she took closer, his heart beat a little faster. What was she doing here? Was she going to cause a scene? Was she going to tell everyone he was a fraud? He didn't know what to expect. Finally, she was at the front of the line. There was no one left behind her. She stepped up to the table and placed a copy of his book on it. She didn't look at him, just at the book. Arav sat frozen, his pen hovering over the open page. He couldn't find his voice. After a long moment, she looked up and her eyes met his. They weren't cold or sharp anymore. They were just, tired. And maybe a little sad. "I read about this in the paper," she said, her voice quiet, nothing like the loud voice he remembered. "I had to see it for myself." She gestured to the book. "The story about the map. It's very clever." Arav just nodded, not sure what to say. She took a small breath as if what she was about to say was difficult. "I saw your parents in the grocery store a few years ago. They told me you were still writing." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I see now. I see I was wrong. The way you use words, it's like you're painting a picture. I never saw that. I'm glad you didn't listen to me. She reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet to pay for the book. The apology was so quiet, so simple, it was more powerful than any big speech could have been. It wasn't an excuse. It was a statement of fact. The weight that Arav had been carrying on his shoulders since he was 8 years old suddenly felt a little bit lighter. He found his voice, and it was steady. "Who should I make it out to?" he asked. "Just your name will be fine," she said softly. He signed the title page with a clear, confident hand. He closed the book and handed it to her. She took it, held it for a moment, and then gave him a small, respectful nod. She didn't say anything else. She just turned and walked away, disappearing between the tall shelves, a solitary figure with his book under her arm. Arav watched her go, a feeling of peace washing over him. It wasn't about winning. It was about closing a door. He took a deep breath, turned to Ms. Anjali, who was giving him a knowing smile from across the room, and felt ready for whatever came next. The quiet that followed the book signing was different from the silence that had once filled Arav's life. It wasn't an empty silence, but a full one, humming with a sense of peace. He went home that night and sat in his room, the same room where he had fought his battles with jumbled letters. The cardboard knights still stood guard, and the pirate ship was still docked on the blue carpet sea. But they looked different now. They were no longer just toys. They were the foundation, the very beginning of the world he had built. He picked up the copy of his book that he had signed for himself. He ran his thumb over his name on the cover. It was real. The quiet validation from Mrs. Davison had been a key, unlocking a final heavy door in his mind, and now he felt truly free. His book, The Map of Whispering Paths, didn't become a runaway bestseller. It didn't get turned into a big movie. Instead, it did something quieter and more profound. It found its people. The reviews started to appear not in major newspapers but on blogs run by parents of children with learning differences. A specialist in teaching dyslexic students wrote an article calling it a breakthrough in narrative accessibility, praising its visual style and dialogue-driven plot. Emails began to trickle into his inbox, then flow steadily. A mother from a town he had never heard of wrote that her son, who had never finished a chapter book in his life, had stayed up all night reading his. A teacher thanked him for giving her students a hero who saw the world a little differently, just like they did. His success wasn't measured in sales figures, but in the small, personal stories of people whose lives his book had touched. Arav soon realized that his story had become bigger than just him. It was a beacon for others who felt lost in the same fog he once navigated. The invitations started to come, not to fancy literary parties, but to places that felt much more important. He was invited to speak at local libraries, at parent-teacher association meetings, and at workshops for special education teachers. At first, the idea of speaking to a crowd terrified him. He was a writer, a man who lived more in his head than on a stage. But he remembered the little boy hiding in the hallway, and he knew he had to go. His first talk was at a small school library, filled with a dozen parents and a few teachers. His hands were shaking as he stood behind the simple podium. He didn't have a fancy presentation. He just had his story. He started by telling them about the jumbled letters, about the feeling of being a broken toy. He spoke about the shame and the frustration, and he saw heads nodding in the audience. He didn't use big words or complicated theories. He just spoke from his heart. He told them about the rain-soaked afternoon he wandered into the library and met a librarian who saw not his problem, but his passion. He talked about audiobooks and graphic novels, not as crutches but as different doors into the magical world of stories. He described his frustrating, clumsy journey with speech-to-text software, not as a hardship but as his training ground. He never once said he overcame his dyslexia. Instead, he explained that he had learned to work with it, to see it not as a wall, but as a filter that gave his imagination a unique color. His message was simple: your brain is not broken. You just learn differently. And that difference can be your greatest strength. Word of his honest, inspiring talk spread. He became a passionate advocate for the idea that there is no right way to learn or create. He spoke at conferences, sharing the stage with doctors and psychologists, But his was always the story that people remembered most. He was living proof that a person's potential could not be measured by a standardized test or a teacher's hasty judgment. He made it his mission to find other kids like him, to look for the ones who were quiet, the ones who stared out the window, the ones whose notebooks were filled with doodles instead of words. He would crouch down to their level and talk to them not about what they couldn't do, but about what they loved. What worlds did they build in their heads? What stories did their action figures tell? He was becoming the mentor he had so desperately needed. This journey brought him to the biggest stage he had ever faced, a national education conference in a huge city. He was the keynote speaker. As he stood backstage, peeking through the curtains at the enormous hall, his heart hammered against his ribs. There were hundreds of people out there, a sea of faces: educators, administrators, parents, specialists. He felt a wave of the old fear, the fear of that little boy who was sure everyone was looking at his mistakes. He took a deep breath, thought of Ms. Angeli's kind smile, and walked out onto the stage. The lights were warm, and he found his mark at the podium. He began his speech, the same one he had refined over the years. The story of a boy in his map doc. As he spoke, his confidence grew. He was no longer just reciting a story. He was living it. He talked about the power of imagination and the danger of low expectations. He made them laugh with stories of his computer's funny mistakes. And he made them thoughtful when he spoke about the kindness of one good librarian. He scanned the crowd, connecting with different faces, sharing his message with everyone. And then, about halfway through his speech, he saw him. In the front row, sitting next to his mother, was a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. The boy was fidgeting in his seat, his small hands twisting the hem of his shirt. He had the same frustrated, faraway look in his eyes that Arav used to see in the mirror every day. He was a ghost from Arav's past, sitting right there in the present, Arav's heart caught in his throat. He saw the mother gently put a hand on the boy's shoulder, trying to get him to sit still. The boy just shrugged it off, his expression a mask of boredom and discomfort. In that moment, the hundreds of people in the audience faded away. It was just Arav and this little boy. He knew, with absolute certainty, why he was there. It wasn't for the applause or the recognition. It was for him. Arav paused his prepared speech. The room went quiet, waiting. He leaned into the microphone, his voice softer now, more intimate. "And I know that there might be some kids out there," he said, his eyes finding the boy in the front row, "who feel like the world is speaking a language they don't understand, who feel like the letters are mean and the words are tricky, who feel like maybe they should just stop trying." The boy looked up, surprised that the man on stage seemed to be talking directly to him. Arav held his gaze, a small knowing smile on his face. "I want to tell you something very important," he continued. "Your story is in there. It is real and it is amazing, and the world needs to hear it. You just have to find your own door to let it out. Don't ever let anyone tell you that your door is the wrong one." He saw a flicker of something in the boy's eyes. It wasn't a miracle, but it was a spark. The boy stopped fidgeting. He just stared back at the man on the stage, listening. Arav held his gaze for another second, giving him a tiny, almost invisible nod of encouragement, a secret pact between the two of them. Then he turned back to the rest of the room and continued his speech, his voice filled with a new energy. When he finished, the entire hall rose to their feet in a thundering ovation. But as Arav stood there, bowing his head, he knew the real victory wasn't the standing ovation. It was the small, quiet moment of connection with a little boy who needed to hear his story. He had not only proved one teacher wrong, he had become the teacher he always wished he had, ensuring that no other child would ever be left alone to believe that their story wasn't worth telling.